The forest was dense, the towering trees casting long shadows over the rugged path. Sir Aldrich, a knight known for his loyalty and courage, rode through the misty wilderness, his mind heavy with the burdens of war. The kingdom of Eldoria had been at peace for many years, but rumors of unrest from the north troubled the court. Aldrich was sent on a diplomatic mission, but the weight of what might come pressed on him more than usual. His steel armor clinked softly as his horse, Heir, trotted carefully along the narrow trail. The day had been long, and the sun had already begun its descent, leaving the forest bathed in hues of orange and deep purple. As Aldrich neared a small clearing, a sound reached his ears, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. He halted Heir, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. He strained to listen, the gentle rustling of leaves mixed with what seemed to be soft crying. Cautiously, Aldrich dismounted and moved towards the sound. The crying grew louder, coming from behind a large oak tree. As he rounded the tree, his eyes fell upon a figure, small, fragile, and shivering. It was a girl, no older than 12, her clothes torn and muddy. Her long, tangled hair hung around her face as she hugged her knees, her back against the tree's rough bark. She was lost, that much was clear. Aldrich's heart softened. His life had been one of battles and duty, but moments like these stirred something deeper within him, a reminder of the humanity that existed beyond the steel and honor. He knelt beside the girl, careful not to startle her. "Are you hurt?" he asked in a voice as gentle as he could muster. She flinched but did not speak, only pulling her knees tighter to her chest. Aldrich's thoughts raced. She was alone in the middle of a dangerous forest with no sign of protection. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small loaf of bread, one of the few provisions he had left. Breaking a piece, he offered it to her. "You must be hungry." The girl hesitated, her eyes flickering between the bread and the knight's face. Slowly, she reached out and took it, her small hands trembling. She ate quickly, as if the act of eating was more instinct than thought. Aldrich waited in silence, watching her closely. She looked malnourished, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes, as if she had been wandering for days. "Do you have a name?" he asked after a few moments. She looked up, her eyes wide and dark, and shook her head slightly. Whether it was fear or she truly had no memory of her name, Aldrich couldn't be sure. The knight sighed softly. "It's all right. I will not harm you. I'm Sir Aldrich of Eldoria. I can take you somewhere safe, away from this forest." He stood, offering his hand to help her up. For a long moment, she simply stared at his outstretched hand, as if deciding whether to trust him. Then, slowly she placed her small hand in his. Her grip was weak, but there was a flicker of resolve in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Aldrich lifted her to her feet, and as he did, he couldn't help but wonder what fate had brought her here. Who was this girl? What had happened to her? But there was no time for questions now. The sun was setting fast, and the forest would soon become a far more dangerous place. He led her back to Heir, lifting her gently onto the horse's back before mounting behind her. "We'll find somewhere safe," he promised. And with that, they rode off, disappearing into the thickening shadows of the forest, unaware that this seemingly small act of kindness would change the fate of the kingdom in ways neither could foresee. The night descended quickly as they rode deeper into the forest. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Aldrich could feel the girl's body tense against his chest as they rode in silence, her small hands gripping the saddle's edge tightly. Though she had accepted his help, the fear in her eyes hadn't faded, and Aldrich understood the unspoken worry. A child, alone in the wilderness, trusting a stranger was no easy thing. The path ahead grew darker, and the sky above was blanketed with a thick layer of clouds, obscuring the moon. Aldrich leaned forward, whispering softly to Heir, guiding her with a firm yet gentle hand. His mind churned with questions. What had happened to this girl? How had she come to be in the middle of the forest? And why was she so hesitant to speak? As they pressed on, Aldrich's thoughts returned to the village of Greenfold, not far from where they were now. He had stopped there briefly the day before on his way to his mission, remembering the warmth of its hearths and the kindness of its people. The village was small, nestled between hills and the edge of the forest, a place where travelers were always welcomed. It was a humble settlement, but it would be safe for the girl. Aldrich decided it was best to take her there for the night. "You'll be safe soon," Aldrich said over the soft clop of hooves, hoping to reassure her. The girl did not respond, but he could feel the tension in her body ease slightly. As they neared the edge of the forest, the trees began to thin, revealing the faint outlines of the village's rooftops in the distance. Greenfold was a sleepy place, the kind of village where nothing much happened, and the people lived simply off the land. Aldrich hoped the quiet peace of the village would help calm the girl's obvious distress. They reached the village just as the last traces of daylight faded completely. The flickering glow of hearth fires illuminated the windows of the small cottages, casting a warm, inviting light on the dirt paths. Aldrich guided Ira towards the local inn, its wooden sign swinging gently in the night breeze. Dismounting carefully, he lifted the girl down, setting her gently on the ground. She seemed to be growing more at ease, though her silence remained. He led her inside, where the heat of the fire immediately embraced them, the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filling the air. The innkeeper, a portly man with a ruddy face and kind eyes, looked up from behind the counter, surprised to see them at such a late hour. "Sir Aldrich, back so soon? What brings you here?" he asked, wiping his hands on a towel. Aldrich offered a nod. "Found this young one in the forest," he replied, glancing down at the girl, who was now standing very still beside him. "She's lost, and I thought it best to bring her somewhere safe for the night." The innkeeper's brow furrowed as he studied the girl. "Poor thing," he murmured. "The forest isn't kind to the unprepared. She's lucky you found her." "Luck had little to do with it," Aldrich replied softly, almost to himself. He placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Do you have a spare room? Just for tonight?" "Of course, Sir Aldrich. For you always," the innkeeper said with a smile, gesturing to one of the maids to prepare a room. The girl glanced around the room with wide eyes, taking in the warmth and safety of the inn. Aldrich could see her begin to relax, her small frame no longer trembling as it had in the woods. He knelt down beside her, speaking softly. "You'll sleep here tonight. No harm will come to you, I promise." For the first time, the girl looked directly into his eyes, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something. But no words came, only a small nod before she looked away again. The maid returned, leading them to a small, cozy room at the back of the inn. Aldrich guided the girl inside, showing her the bed where she would sleep. "Rest now," he said gently. "I'll be close by." The girl climbed into the bed slowly, as if she hadn't seen such comfort in a long time. She curled up under the blanket, her dark eyes watching him as he stood in the doorway for a moment longer. "Good night," Aldrich said softly, closing the door behind him. In the quiet of his own room, Aldrich lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts turned again to the girl, and the strange sense of fate that had drawn him to her. He had always believed that every action had purpose, and this encounter felt like more than mere chance. But as he closed his eyes, sleep finally beginning to claim him, he knew only time would reveal the truth of who she was, and why she had appeared in his life at this moment. The morning sun filtered through the small window of the inn, casting soft beams across the wooden floor. Aldrich rose early, his body still weary from the long ride, but his mind restless. After dressing, he stepped out into the quiet hallway, his thoughts already returning to the girl. He still knew nothing of her story, her name, her origins, or how she had ended up alone in the depths of the forest. Yet something about her troubled him deeply. He made his way downstairs, where the innkeeper was already busy preparing breakfast. The smell of fresh bread and sizzling bacon filled the air, but Aldrich barely noticed as he approached the counter. "How did she sleep?" he asked, his voice low. The innkeeper smiled warmly. "Like a lamb, Sir Aldrich. She must have been exhausted from whatever ordeal brought her to that forest." Aldrich nodded, though the unease in his chest remained. "Has she spoken at all?" The innkeeper shook his head. "Not a word. But she seems calmer this morning, at least." "Good," Aldrich replied, though the mystery only seemed to deepen. He needed answers, but he wasn't about to push her. Not yet. Just then, the sound of soft footsteps descending the stairs drew his attention. He turned to see the girl standing there, dressed in the same tattered clothes from the night before. Her face looked a little brighter in the daylight, but the dark shadows under her eyes remained. She looked at Aldrich, then at the innkeeper, as if unsure what to do next. "Good morning," Aldrich said gently, trying to encourage her to feel at ease. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded slowly, still silent. "Come, have something to eat," he offered, gesturing to the small table by the fire. He could see the hunger in her eyes, though she hesitated at first. With a slight push from the innkeeper, who placed a plate of bread and cheese on the table, the girl sat down. Aldrich watched her carefully as she began to eat, her movements quick but not frantic, as if she had learned to hide her desperation over time. The fire crackled softly beside them, creating a quiet, almost intimate atmosphere. Aldrich took a seat across from her, determined to help her feel safe enough to speak. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said after a few moments. "But I'd like to know your name, if you'll share it." The girl paused, her hand hovering over the bread, her eyes flickering to his. For a moment, it seemed like she might speak, her lips parting slightly. But then, as quickly as it came, the moment passed, and she shook her head again, looking down at her plate. Aldrich sighed inwardly. He knew it would take time, but he couldn't help feeling a growing urgency. The northern unrest, the whispers of rebellion, they all loomed in the back of his mind, reminding him that his time in Greenfold was limited. He couldn't stay indefinitely, and if this girl had no one, she couldn't stay either. "All right," he said softly, not pressing further. "For now, we'll just call you little one until you're ready." She looked up at him again, this time with a faint hint of something in her eyes. Gratitude, perhaps. Or trust, just beginning to form. Aldrich stood, straightening his cloak. "I have some matters to attend to today. Will you stay here where it's safe?" The girl hesitated but then nodded. The innkeeper, who had been watching from the counter, stepped forward. "Don't worry, Sir Aldrich. I'll keep an eye on her. She won't want for anything here." "Thank you," Aldrich said with a nod. He turned back to the girl. "I won't be long. If you need anything, the innkeeper will help." She didn't say a word, but there was a small, almost imperceptible nod from her as she returned to her meal. Aldrich watched her for a moment longer before stepping out into the cool morning air. Outside, the village was already waking. Farmers tended to their fields, and children ran through the streets, laughing as they played. The world seemed peaceful here, but Aldrich couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at work. Not just with the unrest to the north, but with the girl. There was more to her story, something hidden just beneath the surface, and he needed to find out what it was. As he walked towards the stables to check on Ira, Aldrich's mind drifted back to the war that had nearly destroyed Eldoria a decade ago. He had seen things then that no man should ever witness. Children orphaned by the sword, villages burned to ash. Could the girl be a remnant of that violence? Had her family been caught in the flames of that dark time, or was she a survivor of something more recent? The more he thought about it, the more questions surfaced. He couldn't ignore them forever. Soon, he would have to confront the girl's silence, but for now, he had to focus on the task at hand, preparing for his journey north and ensuring that she would be safe in his absence. The sun had climbed higher by the time Aldrich returned to the village. His errands in Greenfold had been brief, mostly gathering supplies and tending to his horse, but his mind had stayed with the girl, troubled by her silence. He knew that if he left without knowing more about her, he might be abandoning her to a fate she could not escape alone. As he approached the inn, he noticed the village was as quiet as ever, but something felt different. He couldn't place it at first, just a subtle shift in the air, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Aldrich shook the feeling off and stepped inside, the warmth of the inn wrapping around him like a familiar cloak. The girl was still there, sitting by the fire, her small form hunched as she gazed into the flames. Her hands were folded in her lap, and for a moment, she seemed so still that Aldrich wondered if she had fallen asleep sitting up. The innkeeper gave him a knowing look as Aldrich approached her. "She hasn't moved much," the innkeeper said softly. "Just sitting there, thinking, I suppose?" Aldrich nodded. He could see it now. She wasn't asleep, but lost in thought, or perhaps memories. He knelt beside her, trying to catch her eye. "Little one," he said softly, "I'd like to speak with you if you're ready." For a moment, she didn't respond, but then, slowly, her gaze shifted to meet his. Aldrich was struck by the depth of sorrow in her eyes, far too heavy for someone so young. He had seen that look before, in soldiers who had witnessed unspeakable horrors, in survivors of war-torn villages. "I know you've been through something," he said gently, "and I won't push you to speak before you're ready. But I need to know if you have anyone, a family, someone who might be looking for you." The girl's lips parted, and for a fleeting moment, Aldrich thought she might finally speak. But then she closed her mouth again, shaking her head almost imperceptibly. No family, no one. Aldrich's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing, or rather, seeing, the confirmation weighed heavily on him. He knew the dangers of the world all too well, and the thought of leaving her alone, vulnerable, gnawed at him. "Very well," he said, leaning back slightly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Then you'll stay with me, at least until we find out more." She blinked at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and something else, a faint glimmer of trust. Aldrich wasn't sure, but it felt like a small step forward. As the day passed, Aldrich stayed close to the girl, trying to make her feel more at ease. They shared a quiet meal together, and though she didn't speak, she began to move with more confidence, as if the security of the inn was slowly working its magic. But there was still a wall between them, an unspoken barrier that Aldrich didn't know how to break. Late in the afternoon, while they sat by the fire, something shifted. The girl, who had been quietly eating a piece of bread, suddenly stopped, her gaze distant as if something had just occurred to her. She looked at Aldrich, her brows furrowed, and then slowly reached into the folds of her ragged cloak. Aldrich watched as she pulled out a small, silver pendant, the chain tangled and worn. She held it out towards him, her eyes pleading for him to understand something she couldn't put into words. Aldrich took the pendant gently, examining it under the firelight. The pendant was delicate, but old, tarnished by time. At its center was an insignia, a symbol he didn't immediately recognize, but it struck him as familiar. A sunburst, surrounded by intricate patterns, almost regal in its design. It was no common trinket. "Where did you get this?" Aldrich asked, looking up at her. The girl didn't answer, but her hand reached up to touch her chest, just over her heart, as if to say it had always been with her. Aldrich's mind raced. This pendant was no mere piece of jewelry, it was a mark of lineage, perhaps even nobility. But whose? He turned it over in his hands, searching for some clue, some detail that might explain its origin, but nothing more came to light. "You've had this for a long time, haven't you?" he asked gently. She nodded. Aldrich's thoughts churned. Could she be of noble birth? Had she been lost, separated from her family? The North was in turmoil, with lords vying for power and whispers of rebellion on the wind. If she was connected to any of those factions, her life could be in grave danger. And by extension, so could his. He had no choice now. He couldn't leave her here, not with what little he knew. If the pendant was indeed a symbol of her past, they needed answers, and soon. "We'll leave tomorrow," Aldrich said, slipping the pendant back into her hand. "You'll come with me, and we'll find the truth about where you belong." The girl held the pendant tightly, nodding once, her trust in him now solidified. Aldrich rose from his seat, the weight of the task ahead settling on his shoulders. Whatever they were about to uncover, he had a sinking feeling it would change everything. For her, for him, and perhaps for Eldoria itself. Dawn came softly over Greenfold, the golden light casting long shadows over the quiet village. Aldrich stood by the stables, saddling Ira, his mind already heavy with the journey ahead. The girl, still unnamed, watched from a distance, standing near the doorway of the inn, clutching the pendant in her small hands as though it were her lifeline. The connection between them, fragile though it was, had solidified after last night. She trusted him enough to follow, and that was enough for now. As Aldrich tightened the saddle straps, the innkeeper approached him, wiping his hands on his apron, his face clouded with concern. "Sir Aldrich," he began cautiously, "are you sure it's wise to take the girl with you? The roads are dangerous, especially with the unrest up north. And she, Well, she's just a child. Aldrich paused, looking over at the girl. She was staring out towards the horizon, her expression distant. He knew the risks, but leaving her behind wasn't an option. Not after what he had seen in her eyes, not after the pendant. She has no one, Aldrich replied quietly. And there's more to her than meets the eye. I can't explain it yet, but I have to see this through. The innkeeper nodded, though his eyes lingered on the girl with unease. Be careful, Sir Aldrich. There are dark things stirring in the world, and sometimes what we don't understand can be the most dangerous. I will, Aldrich assured him, though his thoughts echoed the innkeeper's warning. The pendant had stirred something in him, a sense of foreboding, as if they were stepping into a story far older and far more dangerous than they could comprehend. With Heir ready, Aldrich led the horse towards the girl. She looked up at him with those wide, silent eyes, still clutching the pendant tightly. Aldrich knelt down to her level, his voice gentle. Are you ready? She nodded, and though the fear still lingered in her eyes, there was something else now, a quiet determination, a spark of hope. Aldrich helped her onto the horse, then mounted behind her, holding the reins firmly. He glanced back at the innkeeper, who gave a solemn nod, and then urged Heir forward, leaving the safety of Greenfold behind. The road ahead stretched out before them, winding through forests and fields, the kingdom of Eldoria vast and untamed. As they rode, Aldrich couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading towards something far more significant than he had initially imagined. The pendant was more than just a family heirloom. It was a symbol, perhaps a key to something much greater. For hours, they rode in silence, the girl still quiet, though she occasionally glanced at the world around her with a look of quiet wonder. Aldrich was patient, giving her space to observe and feel the journey in her own way. He knew that the road would be long, and that the answers they sought might be difficult to find, but for now, they had each other. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they came upon a crossroads. To the left, the road led towards the Northern Territories, where Aldrich's mission had originally been intended. To the right, the road veered towards the capital, Eldoria's heart, where the king's court held sway. It was there, Aldrich knew, that they might find scholars or officials who could help identify the insignia on the pendant. But the north, the unrest there worried him. If the girl was tied to some noble house in those lands, she might be walking into even more danger. Aldrich slowed Heir to a halt at the crossroads, his brow furrowed in thought. He turned to the girl, her small frame pressed against his chest, her grip firm on the reins. She looked up at him, waiting, trusting. He weighed the risks in his mind. The capital offered security, but it also meant exposing the girl to the political web of Eldoria. The north, however, was volatile, and if the pendant tied her to any of the warring factions, they could be walking into a storm. Aldrich sighed deeply. We have two paths, he said aloud, more to himself than to her. The capital, where we might find answers, or north, where trouble brews. The girl's eyes were on the pendant again, her fingers tracing the edges of the symbol as if it might tell her what to do. Aldrich watched her closely, searching for some sign that might help him decide. Then, without a word, she pointed north. Aldrich blinked, surprised by her sudden certainty. North? He asked, though he felt he already knew the answer. She nodded firmly this time, the first time she had made a choice on her own since they met. Aldrich hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded. North it is. With a gentle nudge, he steered Heir down the path to the north. The road was rougher here, the trees taller and denser, as if the forest was slowly closing in on them. Aldrich's grip tightened on the reins as they ventured deeper, the air growing cooler, the sense of unease settling over them once more. As they traveled, the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the road. Aldrich's eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, his instincts sharp. The Northern Territories were known for their lawlessness, and bandits often roamed these roads. But the girl seemed calm, her gaze fixed ahead, as if she knew this path, as if it was calling her home. It was well into the evening when Aldrich spotted something in the distance. A small village, tucked away at the edge of the forest. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the glow of hearth fires flickered in the windows. It was a humble place, but it offered shelter. We'll rest here for the night, Aldrich said, guiding Ira towards the village. As they approached, Aldrich noticed the villagers moving about their business, though their eyes were wary. These people were cautious, their lives shaped by the conflict brewing to the north. But Aldrich's presence, marked by his knightly armor, seemed to put them at ease. A few nodded respectfully as he passed, though they kept their distance. Aldrich stopped in front of a small tavern, its door creaking as it swung open. He dismounted and helped the girl down, her feet touching the ground softly. She looked around, her expression unreadable, but her grip on the pendant was tighter than ever. The tavern keeper greeted them with a nod, his eyes lingering on the girl for a moment before returning to Aldrich. "Looking for a place to stay, sir?" he asked. Aldrich nodded. "Just for the night. We'll be gone by morning." The tavern keeper gestured to a table by the fire. "Make yourselves comfortable." Aldrich led the girl inside, seating her by the warm flames. As they sat, the firelight dancing across their faces, Aldrich's thoughts returned to the road ahead. The north was calling, and with it, the secrets of the girl's past. Whatever they found there, Aldrich knew one thing for certain: their journey was only just beginning. The night deepened, and the small tavern offered a modest yet much-needed refuge from the cold outside. The girl sat quietly by the fire, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames. Aldrich, seated across from her, was lost in thought. The road ahead weighed heavily on his mind, and though he had traveled these lands before, something about this journey felt different, more perilous. As the tavern settled into a hushed calm, Aldrich caught snippets of conversation from a group of men seated near the bar. They were farmers, judging by their rough hands and simple clothing, but their tones carried an undercurrent of tension. "More bandits spotted near the northern pass," one man muttered, his voice low. "The king's soldiers are spread too thin. No one's safe on the roads anymore." Aldrich's gaze drifted to the girl. Though she was small and quiet, the weight of whatever past she carried was clearly pressing down on her. The pendant, now hidden under her cloak again, was still a mystery, but one that seemed tied to the unrest in the north. As he listened to the murmurs of the villagers, it became clear that their journey toward the north would not be a simple one. The roads were fraught with danger, and whatever they were heading toward, it was likely tied to the growing tensions between the lords of the land. Finishing the last of his modest meal, Aldrich rose from the table and motioned for the girl to follow. "We should rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be a long day." The girl stood, her movements deliberate, though the exhaustion of travel was beginning to show in her small frame. Aldrich led her to the narrow staircase at the back of the tavern, where a modest room had been prepared for them. The walls were thin, and the bed was little more than straw and rough blankets, but it was enough. The girl climbed onto the bed without protest, curling up under the blankets as if seeking solace in their warmth. Aldrich pulled up a chair by the small window, where he could keep watch over the road outside. The village was still, save for the occasional flicker of movement as villagers closed their doors and shutters for the night. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees in the distance, a haunting sound that only deepened the sense of unease. Aldrich leaned back in his chair, his thoughts turning once more to the north. He had heard rumors of rebellion, whispers of a rising lord seeking to challenge the king's authority. Though the borders of Eldoria had held firm for many years, the northern lords had always been more difficult to control. And now, it seemed, their patience had run thin. The girl's pendant, it had the look of nobility, and Aldrich couldn't shake the feeling that she was tied to one of the great houses of the north. But why had she been alone in the forest? And why hadn't she spoken? Every question only led to more confusion, but the one certainty was this: they were headed into dangerous lands, and whatever answers they sought, they wouldn't come without a price. As the night wore on, the fire in the tavern below crackled softly, its warmth barely reaching the upper floor. Aldrich shifted in his chair, his eyes heavy with fatigue but his mind too restless to sleep. He glanced over at the girl, who had finally drifted off into a quiet slumber. Her face, softened by sleep, looked younger, more vulnerable. She was a mystery, but she was also a child, alone, frightened, and burdened with secrets too heavy for her age. Hours passed, and just as Aldrich's eyelids began to droop, a sound outside caught his attention. A soft clatter, like hooves on cobblestones, though muffled by the wind. His hand instinctively moved to the sword by his side as he rose from his chair, peering out through the small window. In the distance, barely visible under the pale moonlight, a figure on horseback approached the village. The rider was cloaked, their face obscured by the shadows. Aldrich tensed, his mind racing. It was late for travelers, and this village was far off the main roads. Few would venture here unless they had reason to. He watched as the rider dismounted near the edge of the village, tying their horse to a post before disappearing into the shadows. Aldrich's grip on his sword tightened. He couldn't afford to take chances, not with the girl so vulnerable, and not with the dangers that seemed to be closing in around them. Without making a sound, Aldrich moved to the door and slipped out into the hallway. The tavern was silent now, save for the occasional creak of wood in the night wind. He made his way downstairs, his eyes scanning every corner for signs of movement. The rider had entered the village quietly, almost too quietly. Whoever they were, they did not want to be seen. Reaching the entrance of the tavern, Aldrich paused by the door, listening intently. The wind howled, but beneath it he could hear soft footsteps, someone moving through the village, careful and deliberate. He stepped outside, his boots crunching softly on the dirt road. The village square was empty, but Aldrich could sense that someone was watching, waiting. His eyes darted to the shadows, searching for any sign of the rider, but there was nothing, only the eerie quiet of the night. He moved slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, ready for anything. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, a glint of metal, barely visible in the moonlight. A dagger, held close by a cloaked figure who had melted into the shadows of a nearby alley. Aldrich's heart raced, but he kept his composure, stepping forward with measured calm. "Show yourself," he commanded, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. For a moment, there was only silence, and then, slowly, the figure stepped out of the shadows. The cloak fell back slightly, revealing a man with sharp, weathered features, his eyes cold and calculating. He held the dagger loosely at his side, but his stance was poised, ready for a fight if need be. "You shouldn't be here," the man said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Not with her." Aldrich's eyes narrowed. "What do you know of the girl?" The man's lips curled into a grim smile. "More than you ever will, knight. Turn back now, before you find yourself caught in a war that isn't yours." Aldrich's grip tightened on his sword. "Who are you?" "That doesn't matter," the man replied, his voice still calm. "What matters is that she isn't safe. And neither are you." Before Aldrich could respond, the man melted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Aldrich stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding, before rushing back inside the tavern. He hurried up the stairs to the room where the girl slept, his mind racing. Whoever that man was, he knew about the girl, and he had made it clear that their journey was about to grow far more dangerous. Aldrich's breath was steady, though his mind raced. His hand hovered near his sword as he stood over the sleeping girl, every muscle in his body tense, expecting something, or someone, to appear. The man's words haunted him. "She isn't safe. And neither are you." Who was that figure, and how did he know about the girl? Aldrich had spent his life in service to the crown, battling enemies known and unknown, but this felt different. More personal. It was as if they had been targeted, their presence in this remote village already known before they even arrived. And now, the shadows of the north seemed to be reaching out to pull them in. He knelt beside the bed, watching the girl as she slept. Her face, so peaceful in the glow of the dim firelight, showed no signs of the danger that lurked just outside their door. For a moment, Aldrich wondered if he should turn back. Return her to the capital, seek the protection of the king's court where they might be able to unravel the mystery of the pendant without the looming threat of rebellion. But the girl had chosen the path north, and there was something unspoken between them, a sense that this journey was hers as much as it was his. But could he protect her against enemies he didn't understand? Suddenly, the girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked, disoriented for a moment before focusing on Aldrich's face. There was a softness in her gaze, but also a question, as if she could sense his anxiety even in the silence. Aldrich smiled gently, trying to mask his concern. "We'll be leaving early tomorrow," he said quietly. "Rest now." The girl nodded, though her eyes remained on him, searching. For what, Aldrich couldn't be sure, but there was a wisdom in her that belied her years. It was as though she had seen far more of the world than any child should have. Aldrich returned to his seat by the window, his sword now resting across his lap as he kept watch through the rest of the night. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the village eerily silent. He didn't see the cloaked figure again, but that didn't bring him any comfort. Whoever that man was, he had come with a warning that Aldrich could not ignore. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the shutters, Aldrich rose, his body stiff from the long night. He gathered their belongings quietly, careful not to wake the girl just yet. Once everything was packed, he moved to wake her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Her eyes opened instantly, alert and watchful, as if she had never truly slept. "It's time," Aldrich said softly. She nodded, slipping out of bed and gathering her small cloak around her. There was no fear in her movements, only a quiet determination, as if she, too, knew that the safety of the village was an illusion and that they needed to keep moving. Downstairs, the tavern was still empty, the fire from the night before now little more than glowing embers. The tavern keeper was nowhere to be seen, but Aldrich left a few coins on the counter as payment for their stay. He had no desire to linger, not with the threat still hanging over them like a dark cloud. Outside, the village was waking slowly. Farmers were already in the fields, tending to their crops, but they paid little attention to Aldrich and the girl as they mounted Heir and set off down the northern road. The sky was clear and the air was crisp, but Aldrich's thoughts remained clouded with uncertainty. As they rode in silence, the girl held the pendant once more, her fingers tracing its edges as if trying to draw strength from it. Aldrich watched her out of the corner of his eye, the questions still burning in his mind. Who is she? How did this pendant tie her to the north? And why had that stranger warned them away? The road grew rougher as they ventured deeper into the northern territories. The trees here were taller, their branches reaching over the path like twisted fingers. The underbrush was thick, and the sounds of the forest grew louder, birds calling, branches creaking, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the brush. But beneath it all, there was a sense of foreboding, as if the very land itself was watching them, waiting. By midday, they had reached a crossroads, the path splitting in two directions. One road led to a larger town, visible in the distance with its smoke rising lazily into the sky. The other veered further into the wild, towards the northern border where few dared to travel. Aldrich reined in Heir, turning to the girl. "We can stop in the town," he said, pointing to the village on the horizon. "We could gather supplies, maybe rest for a day. Or we can keep heading north, deeper into the territories." He wasn't sure why he gave her the choice. Perhaps it was because he wanted to gauge her reaction, to see where her instincts would lead them. And again, she surprised him. Without hesitation, she pointed north. Aldrich's brow furrowed. "Are you sure?" The girl nodded, her grip tightening on the reins. It was clear to Aldrich now, she knew more than she let on. Or perhaps she simply felt the pull of the north, the way one feels the draw of fate. Either way, there was no turning back now. He steered Heir onto the northern road, the wild path stretching out before them. The air grew colder as they moved further from civilization, and soon, the trees thickened, casting deep shadows over the road. They were entering the heart of the north, a land ruled by old lords and ancient grudges, where the laws of the crown held little sway. Hours passed, and the weight of the journey began to settle on them both. Aldrich's eyes scanned the dense forest around them, always alert, always cautious. He knew the dangers of this land, bandits, rogue knights, even wild beasts, but he also sensed something more. Something unseen, yet present, watching from the shadows. As the sun began to set, casting the sky in hues of red and gold, Aldrich pulled Heir to a stop. "We should make camp for the night," he said, scanning the area for a suitable spot. They were too deep into the wilderness to find an inn now, and the village was far behind them. They found a small clearing just off the road, sheltered by a ring of tall trees. Aldrich dismounted, helping the girl down before securing Heir. He moved quickly, gathering wood for a fire while the girl sat quietly, watching him work. It wasn't long before the fire crackled to life, its warmth a welcome reprieve from the growing chill. As they sat by the fire, Aldrich's thoughts returned to the figure from the night before. The man had known about the girl, perhaps even knew where she came from. But if he had wanted to harm them, why hadn't he struck then? Instead, he had given them a warning, one Aldrich couldn't ignore. "You're not just a lost girl, are you?" Aldrich asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the fire. He hadn't meant to speak the words aloud, but they came unbidden, a reflection of his growing suspicions. The girl didn't respond, but her grip on the pendant tightened once more. It was all the answer Aldrich needed. He sighed, leaning back against a tree, the firelight flickering in his eyes. Whatever secrets she carried, they were growing heavier with each passing mile. And as they ventured deeper into the north, Aldrich knew that the danger would only increase. But one thing was certain, he wouldn't abandon her, no matter what lay ahead. She had chosen him, trusted him, and he wouldn't betray that trust. The night deepened, and as the stars began to shine overhead, Aldrich kept his watch, his sword never far from his side. The north was waiting for them, and with it, the answers they both sought. The fire burned low as the night deepened, casting flickering shadows across the small clearing where Aldrich and the girl sat. The cold northern air had settled in, and the only warmth came from the fire and the thick cloaks wrapped around them. Aldrich sat in silence, his back against a tree, watching the flames dance while the girl sat close, clutching the pendant that had become her constant companion. The wilderness around them was still, save for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of an owl. But Aldrich's instincts told him that they weren't alone. The further north they traveled, the more he felt the presence of unseen eyes watching them from the darkness. It was a feeling he had learned to trust over years of battle and service to the crown, and tonight, that feeling was stronger than ever. Aldrich glanced over at the girl. She seemed calm, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight, but he could see the tension in her small frame. Even if she hadn't spoken a word, she must have felt it too, the sense of being followed, hunted even. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb her, and walked to the edge of the clearing. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword as he scanned the dark forest. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches like twisted arms reaching into the night sky. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the outlines of the trees, but the shadows between them were deep and impenetrable. Aldrich's eyes narrowed as he caught a flicker of movement, just a whisper of motion in the corner of his vision. He turned sharply, his hand tightening on his sword, but there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. But he knew better. Something, or someone, was out there watching them, waiting. He returned to the fire, his expression grim. The girl looked up at him, her eyes questioning, but Aldrich only shook his head. "Rest," he said softly. "I'll keep watch." She didn't argue, though her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer before she curled up beneath her cloak, the pendant still clutched in her hand. Aldrich took his seat by the fire again, his sword resting across his lap. He doubted he would get much rest tonight. As the hours passed, the forest remained eerily quiet. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Aldrich's senses were sharp, every sound and movement drawing his attention, but nothing emerged from the darkness. It was as if whatever had been watching them was content to remain hidden, for now. The night wore on, and Aldrich's mind began to drift, his thoughts returning to the events of the past few days. The girl's sudden appearance, the pendant, the cloaked figure in the village, everything seemed connected, but how? And why was the North calling them so strongly? He felt as though they were walking into a web of secrets and dangers, and the more they traveled, the tighter the web seemed to close around them. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp sound, a twig snapping, close by. Aldrich was on his feet in an instant, his sword drawn as his eyes scanned the darkness. The girl stirred, but Aldrich motioned for her to stay down. His heart raced as he strained to listen, his ears attuned to every sound. The snapping twig had come from the edge of the clearing, but the shadows between the trees revealed nothing. Then a voice, low and cold, broke the silence. "Put away your sword, knight. You won't need it here." Aldrich's grip tightened on his sword as he turned towards the voice. From the shadows, a figure stepped into the dim light of the fire, his face hidden beneath a dark hood. He moved with the grace of someone used to the shadows, his steps silent as he approached. The girl sat up, her eyes wide with fear, but Aldrich moved to stand protectively in front of her. "Who are you?" Aldrich demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "And what do you want?" The hooded figure stopped just outside the circle of firelight, his face still obscured by shadows. "I'm not here to harm you," he said, his voice calm and measured. "But I've been watching you for some time. You're traveling into dangerous lands, Knight. Lands that are no place for a child." Aldrich's eyes narrowed. "And you've been following us, I take it?" The man gave a small nod. "For your own protection?" Aldrich scoffed. "I don't need protection. Especially not from someone who hides in the dark." The figure didn't flinch at Aldrich's words. Instead, he stepped closer, just enough for the firelight to catch the edge of his hood, revealing the lower half of his face. A sharp jawline and the hint of a smile, though it was more of a smirk. "You may not think you need protection, Knight," the man said quietly, "but the girl does." Aldrich's eyes flicked to the girl, who was watching the exchange in silence, her face pale but composed. "What do you know about her?" Aldrich demanded. "Why is she so important?" The man's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "She carries something that many would kill for. Something that, in the wrong hands, could bring war to these lands." Aldrich's blood ran cold. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed only deepened his sense of unease. "The pendant," he said softly. The man nodded. "It's more than a simple heirloom. It's a key. A key to a power that the Lords of the North would give anything to possess." Aldrich felt the weight of the pendant in his mind now, the mystery surrounding it growing darker with each revelation. "What power?" he asked, his voice tight. The man hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "The power to unite the northern territories," he said finally. The pendant belonged to a lost royal line, one that was thought to have been wiped out during the last rebellion. But if the girl is who I think she is, then she's the last living heir. And that makes her more valuable than you can imagine. Aldrich's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. The girl, alone in the forest, clutching a pendant of noble design, silent yet carrying a heavy burden, she wasn't just a lost child. She was the key to a legacy long thought forgotten. And now, the powers of the North would stop at nothing to find her. The hooded man took a step back, his eyes never leaving Aldrich's. "You can still turn back, Knight. Take her south, hide her away. The Lords of the North won't risk venturing into the heart of Eldoria." Aldrich shook his head, his resolve hardening. "She chose to go north. And so did I." The man sighed softly, as if he had expected that answer. "Then you must be prepared for what lies ahead. The Northern Lords won't be the only ones hunting you. There are others, darker forces, that want her for themselves." Aldrich's hand tightened on his sword. "Let them come. I won't let anything happen to her." The man's smirk returned, though it was tinged with a hint of sadness. "Brave words, Knight. But bravery alone won't save her. Nor will it save you." With that, the man turned and disappeared back into the shadows as quickly as he had come, leaving Aldrich and the girl alone by the fire. The forest was silent once more, but the weight of the man's words lingered in the air like a heavy mist. Aldrich sat back down beside the fire, his mind racing. The girl was the last heir to a royal line, and the pendant she carried was the key to uniting the northern territories, a key that could spark a new war. And now, they were being hunted by more than just lords and rebels. Darker forces were at play, forces that Aldrich knew little about but that were clearly closing in on them. He glanced at the girl, who was watching him with wide eyes, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the pendant. For the first time, he saw the fear in her eyes, not just for herself, but for the journey ahead. And for the first time, he felt the weight of responsibility pressed down on him, heavier than his sword and armor combined. "We'll keep going," Aldrich said softly, though the words felt more like a promise to himself than to her. "Whatever lies ahead, we'll face it together." The girl didn't respond, but there was a small nod, almost imperceptible, as she curled up once more beneath her cloak. Aldrich kept his vigil through the rest of the night, his mind haunted by the knowledge that the real danger had only just begun. Dawn broke over the forest in a pale light, casting long shadows through the trees as Aldrich and the girl prepared to continue their journey. The events of the previous night lingered in Aldrich's mind like a storm cloud. The hooded figure's warning about the girl, her pendant, and the forces that were gathering to find them had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. As he packed their belongings and readied Ira, the girl remained quiet, sitting close to the smoldering remnants of their fire. She had barely spoken, but Aldrich could see that something had shifted in her. She understood now, perhaps more than ever, the danger that surrounded them and the burden she carried. Once they were ready to leave, Aldrich helped the girl onto Ira's back before climbing up behind her. He took one last glance at the forest behind them, searching the shadows for any sign of the hooded figure, but there was nothing. The air was still, but Aldrich knew better than to let his guard down. They were being watched. They had been for days. They set off again, heading deeper into the northern territories. The road was rougher here, the trees denser and more twisted, their branches clawing at the sky as if trying to block out the sun. The further north they traveled, the colder the air became, and the girl wrapped her cloak tighter around her small frame as they pressed on. The forest felt different today, darker, heavier, as though the very land itself knew of the danger that lay ahead. Aldrich's hand never strayed far from his sword, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the shadows between the trees. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. He had been in dangerous territory before, but this was different. There was an unseen enemy lurking just beyond their sight. By midday, the road opened up into a vast clearing, where the forest gave way to rolling hills. In the distance, Aldrich could see the outline of a large fortress, a stone structure, ancient and weathered by time. Its high walls rose against the backdrop of the northern mountains, and the banners that flew from its towers were unfamiliar to Aldrich. "That's not one of the king's fortresses," he muttered to himself, his brow furrowing. The girl looked up at the fortress, her eyes narrowing as if trying to place it. "Do you know it?" Aldrich asked, his voice soft but urgent. She shook her head, but there was hesitation in her eyes. It was clear that something about the fortress stirred her, though she couldn't, or wouldn't, say why. Aldrich weighed his options. The road ahead was long, and the journey into the heart of the north would only grow more perilous. Stopping at the fortress could offer them shelter and perhaps some answers about the region, but it could also expose them to more danger. If the fortress was controlled by one of the northern lords, they might be walking into a trap. He turned to the girl again, her small frame silhouetted against the stark landscape. "We need to decide," he said, glancing towards the fortress. "If we stop there, we risk being seen, but we could gather supplies, learn more about where we're headed. Or we can keep going, stay on the road, and take our chances in the wild." The girl hesitated, her gaze fixed on the fortress. Then, slowly she nodded towards it. Aldrich sighed. He had expected this. Something about the place seemed to call to her, though she couldn't explain why. "All right," he said, steering Ira towards the fortress. "But we'll be cautious." As they approached the walls, Aldrich could see the guards posted at the gate. They wore the dark colors of a northern house, though not one he recognized. Their faces were grim, their eyes sharp as they watched the road. Aldrich kept his hand close to his sword, though he made no move to draw it. They needed to appear as travelers, not threats. When they reached the gate, one of the guards stepped forward, his eyes flicking from Aldrich to the girl with a hint of suspicion. "What business do you have here?" the guard asked, his voice rough and authoritative. "We're travelers," Aldrich replied, keeping his tone steady. "Heading north. We need shelter for the night, and perhaps some supplies." The guard's eyes lingered on the girl for a moment longer before he nodded. "You can stay the night," he said, though his tone suggested that this was not an invitation but a command. "But be warned, we don't tolerate trouble here. Keep to yourselves and you'll have no problems." Aldrich inclined his head in thanks, guiding Ira through the gates and into the fortress. Inside, the courtyard was bustling with activity. Soldiers sparred in one corner, their swords clashing in a rhythm that echoed off the stone walls. Merchants peddled their goods, their voices rising above the din of the crowd. And in the center of it all, A great hall loomed, its doors open, revealing glimpses of a long table lined with food and drink. Aldrich dismounted, helping the girl down from Heir's back. He kept a close eye on their surroundings, wary of anyone who might take too much interest in them. This fortress was unlike any he had seen in Eldoria. Its people, its customs, even the architecture spoke of an ancient power that predated the current kingdoms. And that made Aldrich uneasy. He led the girl towards the stable, where they could leave Heir for the night. As they walked, he noticed that the girl's grip on the pendant had tightened again, her knuckles white as she clutched it close to her chest. Whatever this place was, it was stirring something deep inside her, something that both frightened and intrigued her. Once Heir was stabled, Aldrich turned to the girl. "We'll find a place to rest," he said quietly, "but we need to be careful here. Keep your hood up and stay close to me." She nodded, pulling her hood further over her face as they made their way through the courtyard and into the great hall. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the scent of roasting meat and freshly baked bread. The hall was filled with people, soldiers, nobles, and commoners alike, all gathered around long tables, feasting and talking in low voices. Aldrich found them a quiet corner, away from the main crowd, and they sat down. As they ate in silence, Aldrich's eyes roamed the hall, searching for anything that might give him a clue about who ruled this place. The banners on the walls bore a strange insignia, a wolf entwined with a serpent, a symbol he didn't recognize. Just as he was beginning to relax, a figure caught his eye, a man, sitting at the head of the table, dressed in dark furs and armor. His hair was long and wild, his beard thick, and his eyes cold and calculating. He watched the room with a predatory gaze, his hand resting casually on the hilt of a sword that hung at his side. Aldrich's instincts screamed at him. This man was dangerous. "Who is he?" Aldrich whispered to one of the nearby servants, careful not to draw too much attention. The servant glanced nervously at the man before leaning closer to Aldrich. "That's Lord Varick," he whispered, "the ruler of this fortress. He's not a man to be crossed, especially by outsiders." Aldrich nodded, his unease deepening. Lord Varick's gaze swept the hall, lingering for a moment on Aldrich and the girl before moving on. Aldrich felt a chill run down his spine. They needed to leave. So, as the night wore on, Aldrich's sense of danger grew. He could feel eyes on them, not just Lord Varick's, but others as well, watchful, suspicious. He stood, gesturing for the girl to follow. "We need to find somewhere to sleep," he said quietly, leading her out of the great hall and into the narrow corridors of the fortress. But even as they found a small, secluded room to rest for the night, Aldrich knew that they were not safe here. This fortress, with its ancient walls and dangerous lord, held secrets that could unravel everything they were trying to protect. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching. The fortress was cold at night, its stone walls seeming to draw the heat from the very air. Aldrich lay awake on the straw-filled mattress, his body tense despite the exhaustion that clung to him. The small room he had found for them was as secluded as he could manage, tucked away from the main halls and bustling activity. Yet even here, in the supposed safety of this room, Aldrich felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them. The girl slept beside him, her small frame wrapped in the rough blankets, the pendant still clasped tightly in her hand. In the dim light of the room, her face was calm, but Aldrich knew that beneath the surface, she was as uneasy as he was. The dangers they faced weren't just those of the road or the wild north. There were forces within this very fortress, forces that were watching them, waiting for the moment to strike. Aldrich rose quietly, careful not to wake her, and moved to the small window. The fortress courtyard was still, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. The guards patrolled the walls, their footsteps echoing faintly in the night air. In the distance, he could just make out the silhouette of Lord Varick's tower, its dark windows like hollow eyes staring down at the fortress below. Varick. The name alone filled Aldrich with unease. The man had watched them during the feast, his predatory gaze lingering on the girl far too long. Aldrich had sensed the danger the moment they entered the hall, and the feeling hadn't left him since. Varick knew something, or perhaps he simply suspected, that the girl was more than she appeared. A soft knock at the door broke Aldrich from his thoughts. His hand moved to his sword instinctively, but he hesitated before drawing it. The knock was too subtle for a guard or intruder. He opened the door cautiously, his eyes narrowing as they fell on a servant, one of the same who had worked in the great hall during the feast. "Sir Aldrich," the servant whispered urgently. "Lord Varric has requested your presence." Aldrich's jaw tightened. He had expected this. Varric wasn't the type to let strangers wander his fortress without demanding answers. Aldrich glanced back at the girl, still sleeping soundly. He didn't want to leave her alone, but refusing Varric's summons could be just as dangerous as any trap that might be set for them. "Wait here," he told the servant, before moving back to the girl's side. He knelt down, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open, still groggy with sleep. "I have to meet with Lord Varric," Aldrich whispered. "Stay here and keep the door locked. If anyone tries to enter, call for me." The girl nodded, her fingers tightening around the pendant. Aldrich could see the worry in her eyes, but she didn't protest. She trusted him, and that trust weighed heavily on him now. He couldn't afford to make a wrong move. Aldrich rose and followed the servant out into the narrow corridors of the fortress. The stone halls were silent, save for the occasional distant murmur of a guard on patrol. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows on the walls, and Aldrich's every step seemed to echo louder than it should have. The servant led him through a series of winding corridors, deeper into the heart of the fortress. Aldrich kept his hand close to his sword, his senses alert for any sign of danger. It wasn't long before they reached a heavy wooden door, adorned with the same strange insignia of the wolf and serpent that Aldrich had seen throughout the fortress. The servant knocked softly, and a deep voice from within beckoned them to enter. Aldrich stepped inside, his eyes immediately falling on Lord Varric, who sat behind a grand table near the center of the room. The chamber was dimly lit, with tapestries hanging from the walls and a large fireplace crackling with low flames. Varric's eyes gleamed in the firelight as he regarded Aldrich with a cool, calculating expression. "Sir Aldrich," Varric said smoothly, his voice like silk over steel. "I trust you are finding my fortress to your satisfaction." Aldrich inclined his head, his expression guarded. "Your hospitality is appreciated, Lord Varric." Varric gestured to the chair across from him. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." Aldrich hesitated for only a moment before sitting. He could feel the weight of Varric's gaze on him, and though the man's tone was civil, there was a dangerous edge beneath it. "I've heard stories of you, Aldrich of Eldoria," Varric began, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "A knight of the crown, loyal and honorable. But your presence here in the north is curious. You and the girl." Aldrich's muscles tensed at the mention of the girl. Varric's eyes flickered with interest, his smile thin and sharp. "Eldoria is far from here, and the roads to the north are not traveled lightly," Varric continued. "Especially not with a child. I wonder what brings a knight such as yourself into these lands. And with a companion so unique?" Aldrich met Varric's gaze, refusing to flinch. He had expected this line of questioning, but he had no intention of revealing the truth to this man. "Not yet. We're traveling north to avoid the unrest," Aldrich said carefully. "The girl has no family. I found her alone in the woods, and I'm taking her somewhere safe." Varric's smile widened, though there was no warmth in it. "Safe," he mused. "A noble goal, to be sure. But safety is hard to find in the north these days. War is coming, Aldrich. The lords are gathering their forces, each vying for power. And power? Well, power is always worth fighting for." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with something darker. "Especially when that power is tied to ancient bloodlines. Bloodlines that were thought lost, until now." Aldrich's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. Varric knew. Or at least he suspected. "The girl," Varric said softly, "is not what she seems, is she?" Aldrich's grip on the armrest tightened. He had to tread carefully here. Varric was a dangerous man, and he was playing a dangerous game. "She's a child," Aldrich replied evenly. "That's all." Varric's smile faded, and for a moment, the room seemed to grow colder. "You can play the loyal knight all you like, Aldrich," Varric said, his voice turning icy. But I know what she carries. The pendant she clutches so tightly, it is a relic of the old world, a symbol of a royal line that has long since been erased from the histories. Aldrich's pulse quickened. The pendant? How could Varric know so much? Varric rose from his seat, pacing slowly around the table, his hands clasped behind his back. The girl's blood is tied to a power that many would kill for. A power that could unite the Northern Lords under one banner, or plunge this land into chaos. And you, Knight, you are walking her straight into the jaws of that war. Aldrich stood, his muscles coiled with tension. What do you want, Varric? Varric stopped, turning to face Aldrich with a cold, calculating smile. What I want is simple. The girl's heritage is of great interest to me and to others. But unlike those who would seek to use her as a pawn, I offer something different. He stepped closer, his voice low and smooth. Bring her to me, Aldrich. I will protect her, guide her. Together, we could ensure her safety and shape the future of the North. She could be the key to a new era, an era where the North is no longer divided, but united under a single ruler. Aldrich's hand moved instinctively to his sword. You would use her for your own ends? Varric's smile never faltered. Use her? No, Sir Aldrich. I would give her power. The power to claim her rightful place in this world. Or, he added, his tone darkening, you can refuse my offer and face the wrath of those who would see her destroyed. The room was silent, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Aldrich's mind raced. He had no intention of handing the girl over to Varric, but he knew that refusing outright would put them in even greater danger. Varric's influence was strong, and if he turned against them, it would be nearly impossible to escape the fortress unscathed. I need time to think, Aldrich said, his voice measured. Varric's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, as though he had already won. Of course, Sir Aldrich. Take all the time you need. But remember, he added with a pointed look, the longer you wait, the closer danger comes. Aldrich nodded stiffly, then turned and left the room, his mind swirling with Varric's words. He knew now that they couldn't stay in the fortress. Varric had plans for the girl, and those plans would only lead to her being used as a tool for power. They needed to leave, and fast. Aldrich moved swiftly through the narrow corridors of the fortress, his steps purposeful but silent. The conversation with Lord Varric weighed heavily on him, his mind racing with the implications of what he had learned. The girl, the last heir to a forgotten royal bloodline, was in more danger than either of them had realized. Varric's offer had been thinly veiled in promises of protection and power, but Aldrich knew better. The Lord's ambition was clear, and if they stayed any longer, the girl would become a pawn in his dangerous game. The fortress was alive with the quiet hum of its night activities. Guards patrolled the walls, and the occasional servant passed through the halls, their eyes avoiding his as he made his way back to the small room where the girl waited. Aldrich kept his hand close to the hilt of his sword, his body tense with the knowledge that their time in this place had run out. As he neared the room, the creak of the door being opened caused his heart to jump. His pace quickened, his hand moving to the door, which had been left slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside, immediately on alert. The girl was still there, sitting on the edge of the small bed, her dark eyes wide and watchful. Relief washed over him for a brief moment. She looked up at him, sensing his urgency before he even spoke. "We have to go," Aldrich said quietly but firmly. "No." The girl didn't hesitate. She stood quickly, pulling her hood up over her head and gripping the pendant tightly in her hand. Aldrich could see the fear in her eyes, but there was also a flicker of determination, as if she had known this moment would come. Aldrich quickly gathered their few belongings, securing them tightly before gesturing for her to follow. They slipped out of the room and into the dimly lit corridor, the faint glow of torches casting long shadows on the stone walls. Aldrich moved with purpose, his steps careful but fast, always mindful of the possibility of being caught. The girl kept close to him, her small frame moving silently beside him. The fortress was a maze of passageways and hidden stairwells, but Aldrich had memorized the path they had taken upon their arrival. He led them through a series of narrow halls, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the guards were likely stationed. His every sense was alert, his body coiled with tension, ready to spring into action at the slightest sign of danger. As they neared the stable, where Ira was housed, Aldrich's heart began to pound. He knew that once they reached the gates, getting out would be the real challenge. Varric would not let them leave so easily, not now that he knew the girl's significance. But they had no choice. Staying in the fortress would only end with her being claimed by Varric or worse, delivered into the hands of those even more dangerous. They reached the stable, and Aldrich quickly moved to saddle Ira. The horse stirred slightly as he worked, but she remained calm, sensing the urgency in her master's movements. The girl stood near the entrance, her eyes darting nervously between the shadows, listening for any sound that might indicate they had been discovered. Aldrich finished saddling the horse and turned to the girl. "Climb on," he whispered. She hesitated for only a moment before scrambling onto Ira's back, her small hands gripping the reins as Aldrich mounted behind her. He scanned the courtyard one last time, his eyes locking on the gates that stood closed in the distance. 2 guards stood watch, their weapons at their sides, their posture relaxed. But Aldrich knew better than to trust in appearances. Varric's men were sharp, and they would not be easily fooled. Still, he had no other option. They had to leave now, before Varric realized they were gone. He nudged Ira forward, guiding her through the courtyard as casually as he could manage, hoping to blend in with the late-night comings and goings of the fortress. The guards at the gate remained unaware of their approach, their conversation low and casual. Aldrich's heart pounded as they neared the gates, every instinct screaming at him to be ready for anything. As they closed the distance, one of the guards finally looked up, his brow furrowing in suspicion. Aldrich's muscles tensed, his hand ready to draw his sword at a moment's notice. "Halt!" the guard called, stepping forward. "Where do you think you're going at this hour?" Aldrich pulled Ira to a stop, his mind racing. He could sense the guard's growing suspicion, his eyes darting from Aldrich to the girl and back again. Aldrich knew he had only moments to act. "I'm on Lord Varric's orders," Aldrich said, his voice calm but firm. "We're leaving to scout the northern road." The guard's eyes narrowed. "At this hour? I wasn't informed of any scouting parties." Aldrich's grip tightened on the reins. The second guard was now watching them closely as well, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. They had only moments before this escalated. Without warning, Aldrich drew his sword in a swift motion, catching the first guard off guard. With a quick, decisive strike, he disarmed the man, sending his sword clattering to the ground. Before the second guard could react, Aldrich was upon him, knocking him to the ground with the flat of his blade. "Go!" Aldrich shouted to the girl, spurring Ira forward through the open gate. The girl clung tightly to the reins as they galloped through the gates and out onto the open road, the fortress shrinking behind them. The night air was cold against their faces as they raced down the road, the wind whipping through Aldrich's hair. He knew it wouldn't be long before Varric realized they were gone, and he would send men after them. But for now, they had a head start, and Aldrich was determined to put as much distance between them and the fortress as possible. The road stretched out before them, dark and winding through the dense forest. Aldrich kept his eyes on the path ahead, his mind focused on getting them as far away from Varric's reach as he could. The girl remained silent, her grip firm on the saddle, but Aldrich could feel the tension in her body. She knew the danger they were in, and her silence spoke volumes. As the night wore on, the fortress disappeared behind them, swallowed by the thick trees and the shadows of the northern wilderness. Aldrich's mind raced, calculating their next move. They couldn't return to the main roads, not with Varric's men likely on their trail. They would have to venture deeper into the wild, towards the mountains where few dared to go. It was dangerous, but it was their only chance of escaping Varric's reach. After what felt like hours, Aldrich slowed Ira to a stop, pulling off the main road and into a small clearing. He dismounted, helping the girl down from the horse as he surveyed their surroundings. The forest was dense here, the trees towering high above them, their branches swaying gently in the wind. "We'll rest here for a moment," Aldrich said quietly, his voice low and steady. "But we can't stay long. They'll be looking for us." The girl nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. Aldrich could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but there was also a spark of resolve. She was stronger than she looked, and despite the fear that undoubtedly gripped her, She hadn't once complained or hesitated. Aldrich moved to check on Ira, making sure the horse was unharmed from their escape. As he worked, his mind turned to the next steps. They would need to find shelter, a place to regroup and plan their next move. But more than that, Aldrich needed answers. Varric had revealed only pieces of the puzzle, and if they were going to survive, Aldrich needed to know exactly what they were up against. As they rested in the quiet of the clearing, Aldrich knelt beside the girl, his voice gentle but firm. "We need to keep moving. But there's something you have to tell me. The pendant, what does it mean?" The girl hesitated, her fingers tracing the outline of the pendant beneath her cloak. For a moment, Aldrich thought she might remain silent as she had before, but then, slowly, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with something deeper than fear, something like resignation. "It's a key," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "To a power that was lost long ago." Aldrich's heart quickened. "The key? To what?" She shook her head slightly, her expression troubled. "I don't know everything. But my family, the people who carried this pendant, they were once rulers. Of the North." Aldrich sat back on his heels, the weight of her words sinking in. A key to a lost power, a royal lineage that had been erased from history. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was far more dangerous than Aldrich had imagined. "And now," she continued softly, "there are those who want it back. They want to use it to claim the North. To start a war." Aldrich exhaled slowly, his mind reeling from the revelation. He had known the girl was important, but this was something far greater than he had anticipated. She wasn't just an orphan child, she was the heir to a power that could reshape the entire kingdom. And now, every step they took brought them closer to the heart of that power, and the danger that came with it. Aldrich stood, his resolve hardening. "Then we keep moving," he said, his voice firm. "We'll find the answers we need, but we can't let anyone take that power. Not Varric, and not anyone else." The girl nodded, her grip on the pendant tightening as she looked up at him with newfound determination. Together, they mounted Ira once more and set off into the dark forest, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on their shoulders. The North was waiting, and with it, the fate of kingdoms. The cold air bit at Aldrich's skin as they rode deeper into the northern wilderness. The dense forest slowly gave way to jagged cliffs and rocky terrain, the landscape becoming harsher with each passing hour. The girl sat quietly in front of him, her grip on the reins tight as she stared ahead, her thoughts seemingly far from the present moment. They had been riding for hours, putting as much distance between themselves and Varric's fortress as possible, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on them both. The sky overhead was a pale gray, thick with clouds that threatened snow. The northern mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks dusted with frost, rising like ancient sentinels guarding the secrets of the land. Aldrich had never ventured this far into the north before, and as the land grew wilder, he felt the pull of something ancient, something powerful that had been buried in these lands for centuries. "We're close," the girl whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible over the wind. Aldrich glanced down at her, surprised. "Close to what?" She turned her head slightly, her dark eyes meeting his. "The place where it all began. Where the pendant was first forged." Aldrich frowned. "And how do you know this?" "I don't know," she admitted softly. "It's just a feeling. I've felt it ever since we started heading north. Like it's pulling me, guiding me." Aldrich's grip on the reins tightened as he stared at the mountains ahead. The power the girl carried, the power tied to the pendant, was far greater than he had imagined. It wasn't just a symbol of royal lineage, it was a living force, drawing them towards something ancient and dangerous. As they pressed on, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and ice. Aldrich urged Ira forward, navigating the rocky path that wound up into the foothills of the mountains. They would need to find shelter soon, but the pull of the mountains was undeniable, and he could sense that whatever they were searching for lay just beyond the next ridge. By the time they reached a small plateau, the sky had darkened further, and a light snow had begun to fall. Aldrich slowed Ira to a halt, scanning the landscape for any sign of shelter. The girl, however, was already slipping off the horse, her eyes fixed on something ahead. "There," she said, pointing to a narrow gap in the rock face. Aldrich dismounted and followed her gaze. At first, he saw nothing but stone and snow, but as they moved closer, he saw it, a narrow opening hidden in the side of the mountain. It was barely noticeable, almost as if it had been carved into the rock to remain concealed. The girl moved towards it with purpose, and Aldrich quickly grabbed the reins of the horse, leading Heir behind them. The entrance was just wide enough for them to squeeze through, and as they stepped inside, Aldrich was struck by the stillness of the place. The wind howled outside, but within the air was calm, and the sound of their footsteps echoed faintly off the stone walls. The passageway was long and narrow, and as they ventured deeper, Aldrich felt a strange energy in the air, as though the very walls of the mountain were alive with ancient power. The girl moved with certainty, as if she knew exactly where she was going, her small hand resting protectively over the pendant. After what felt like an eternity of walking, the passage opened into a vast cavern. Aldrich stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The cavern was enormous, its ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness, and at the center of the space stood an ancient stone altar, weathered by time but still intact. Around the altar, the walls of the cavern were covered in strange, intricate carvings, symbols and figures that Aldrich couldn't decipher, but they were unmistakably ancient. The air here was thick with the weight of history, and as Aldrich stepped forward, he felt the power of the place settle over him like a heavy cloak. The girl approached the altar, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. The pendant around her neck seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, as though it was responding to the energy of the cavern. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the cold stone of the altar. "What is this place?" Aldrich asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "This is where it began," the girl said softly, her gaze never leaving the altar. "This is where my family's power was born. The pendant was forged here, long ago, by the first of my ancestors. It's the key to a power that can unite the North, or destroy it." Aldrich's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the altar, the weight of the girl's words sinking in. The power she carried was no mere relic of the past. It was alive, and it had the potential to change the course of history. But with that power came danger, and Aldrich knew that others would stop at nothing to claim it for themselves. As they stood there, a low rumble echoed through the cavern, and Aldrich's hand flew to his sword. The ground beneath them trembled slightly, as if the mountain itself was stirring. The girl's eyes widened, and she stepped back from the altar, her grip on the pendant tightening. Before Aldrich could react, the shadows at the far end of the cavern shifted, and from the darkness emerged a figure, cloaked and hooded, his movements slow and deliberate. Aldrich's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped into the dim light, revealing a face etched with age and power. The man's eyes gleamed with a dangerous intelligence as he regarded them, his voice deep and resonant. "You've come at last." Aldrich's sword was halfway drawn before the man raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "There's no need for violence, knight. I am not your enemy." "Who are you?" Aldrich demanded, his voice tense. The man's gaze flicked to the girl, and a slow smile spread across his face. "I am the one who has been waiting for her to return." The girl took a step back, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Return? I don't understand." The man's expression softened, though his eyes remained sharp. "You are the last of the line. The last of the blood that carries the power to shape the North. And now that you are here, the power can be reclaimed." Aldrich's grip on his sword tightened. "What do you want with her?" The man's gaze shifted to Aldrich, and his smile faded. "It's not about what I want, knight. It's about what she must do. The power of the pendant can be used for good or evil. It can unite the North as it was meant to, or it can plunge the land into chaos. The choice is hers." The girl's eyes filled with uncertainty as she looked between Aldrich and the man. I don't know what to do." Aldrich stepped forward, his voice firm but gentle. "You don't have to do this. We can leave, find another way. You don't owe anyone your power." The man's eyes flashed with something darker. "There is no other way. The lords of the North are already moving. War is coming whether you want it or not. But with the power of the pendant, you could stop it. You could bring peace to the land." The girl's hands trembled as she clutched the pendant, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Aldrich could see the weight of the decision pressing down on her, the impossible choice she was being forced to make. "Don't listen to him," Aldrich said softly, stepping closer to her. "You don't have to do this alone." The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "But if I don't use the power, the war will destroy everything?" Aldrich placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady and reassuring. "We'll find another way. Together." For a long moment, the cavern was silent, the air heavy with the weight of the decision. The man watched them, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of impatience in his eyes. Finally, the girl nodded, her grip on the pendant loosening as she took a deep breath. "I won't use the power," she said quietly, her voice trembling but resolute. "Not like this." The man's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Aldrich saw the true depth of his ambition. "You're making a mistake," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Without that power, the North will burn. You will burn." Aldrich stepped between the girl and the man, his sword fully drawn now. "If there's to be a war, then we'll fight it. But she won't be your pawn." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Aldrich thought he might strike. But instead, the man stepped back, his lips curling into a cold smile. "Very well, knight. But know this, you cannot outrun fate. The power will find her again, whether she wants it or not." With that, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Aldrich and the girl alone in the vast, silent cavern. Aldrich sheathed his sword, his heart still racing as he turned to the girl. She was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the pendant tightly to her chest. "Leave this place," Aldrich said gently, guiding her away from the altar. "We'll find a way to stop the war without using the power." The girl nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the altar, as if the weight of her decision still lingered there. Together, they made their way back through the narrow passage, leaving the ancient cavern and its dangerous secrets behind. But as they stepped out into the cold northern air, Aldrich knew that their journey was far from over. The power of the pendant would continue to haunt them, and the forces that sought to claim it would not rest. The war was coming, and with it, the fate of the North hung in the balance. But whatever came next, they would face it together.